In discussing any religion, one aspect which newcomers most frequently ask about is that of death, the afterlife, and by extension, conceptions of soul or spirit. This only makes sense. The conceptions of heaven within Christianity, the forgiveness of sin, and reuniting between humanity and divinity plays a paramount role in the Christian understanding of the world. But it also might not surprise newcomers to learn that, while death is a fact of life and included within all religion, the exclusivity or even existence of an afterlife and the nature of the soul and of deities of death varied drastically between ancient cultures. In Scandinavia, a multifaceted concept of afterlives would see different classes or professions of people depart to different worlds. Lady Hel residing over Helheim, Odin over Asgard, Freya over Folkvagnar, with the virtuous making the journey to the afterlife, but the unfortunate lost on Earth. Ancient Greeks were diverse, and their conceptions evolved and were debated between different eras and competing schools of philosophy. But in general, archaic and classical Greece believed in an underworld ruled by a single god, most often Hades, where many souls roamed in a state of amnesia or restlessness, while a few might be subject to punishment or rewarded with paradise. Celts and continental Germans varied further in their views, but typically saw an otherworld as a paradise spent with one's ancestors, a liminal type of place reached by caves or sailing far away into the Western Sea. To understand ancient Slavic conceptions of death, we need to unravel many distinct but interconnecting ideas. It's easiest to start with their physical evidence and discussion of funerary customs. From there, we can reconstruct conceptions of the soul and what happens when someone dies, which gives us context for defining the gods who relate to that process, which will then allow us to reconstruct the journey of a soul from death to afterlife. This is a long and complicated discussion, but there's no simpler way to examine these individual concepts on their own, since they supply context to one another. So, with our goals in mind, let's embark on the journey to answer, how did ancient Slavs view death and the afterlife? Before Christianity, most Slavic cultures practiced cremation, though some cultures, mostly those of the Far East, continually buried their dead without physical reduction. But regardless of what was done to the body itself, the rest of a grave remains fairly similar, suggesting both methods served similar theology. The deceased were buried with wide varieties of goods, often personal keepsakes like toys or individualized jewelry, replicas of axes used in life or used by fellow community members, possibly children children wearing an axe pendant which matched the axe of their parent, along with ornamental pieces which probably served a religious function, possibly as an offering or dedication to a patron deity, spirits, or ancestors, while other pieces of jewelry might have served a function similar to jewelry worn today, in use as protective or magical amulets. Other grave goods include valuables like gold coins, sometimes placed over eyes, which might have served as offerings to the gods of death, as they did in neighboring cultures. Other objects might have been identified as gifts from the living to the deceased, a sort of offering to the specific person being buried in a grave on behalf of their living family and community. Whether cremated or buried, caskets and urns were designed with intention, from the selection of wood, often elm or oak, to the design of an urn, the decoration of either with protective and symbolic artwork, and their arrangement alongside goods, and their position relative to nature. Every stage of a funeral was deeply ceremonialized. Some regions would place the deceased on the door to their home, often already decorated by protective symbols. Others extended funerals past even a communal event, with feasts or even games and public celebration as part of remembrance. Regardless of the regional customs, the deceased were most often cleaned and given prayers and songs from the living at the funeral, where not only the family but often the entire community gathered to make offerings to ancestors, spirits, or gods, and help the deceased through prayer. Folk stories record that spousal suicide, the choice of a spouse to cause their own passing to join their partner in their grave, wasn't necessarily commonplace, but was practiced often enough to be known of. Archaeological study of Proto-Slavic cultures have found occasional so-called lovers' graves, which typically show one spouse suffering mortal wounds and the other showing signs of poisoning, verifying some truth to folklore motifs of spousal suicide, though it's difficult to know whether these spouses willingly gave their lives, or if they were sacrificed by the community. While frequencies of either can only be speculated on, it's likely both practices happened at least occasionally. It was common for the deceased to be buried within 2 or 3 days of their death, with a period from a few days to a few weeks spent by the living mourners gathered in remembrance, leaving offerings, placing charms and magical ornaments around their homes, announcing themselves as they backed up or walked through a doorway, and covering all mirrors in their home, placing protective symbols on their windows, reflecting a belief that the lingering spirit of the recently deceased wandered around their home. Several Slavic regions observed a sort of second funeral, around a year after the first, where living family gathers around the deceased's grave and leaves offerings from objects to food to initially bonfires near the grave, and later lighting candles instead. Customs like these are also repeated annually, within several holidays dedicated to ancestors spanning the autumn, winter, and spring, along with additional customs inviting dead ancestors into the home to share with the living's evening time meal and other celebrations at said graveside bonfires. Many religions, from Germanic heathens to Hellenic Greeks, considered the soul or spirit to be made of several parts, with details adjusting by region and time frame. Most Slavs knew a two-part soul, one soul within the head and one within the stomach and heart. The soul of the head was the personality, every thought and characteristic of a person which made them who they were, and this was a component which would leave for a journey to an afterlife. Within the gut or heart was the breath, the inhalation, a sort of life force which was possessed by people along with animals and the many nature spirits of plants, objects, or locations. The breath stored in the heart would return to the land when remains were buried and be recycled into a new form of life. The shared nature of the breath between types of life is often described as animism, a concept which has varied heavily between cultures and centuries, but which generally describes a belief that all life, and even inanimate objects, possess a soul. Returning attention to the soul of the head is seemed to sometimes be split in half, or that some regions placed two souls within the head. One was a person's thoughts and self-aware and awake, while the other was unthinking, a shadow or echo of the first. So when imagined this way, one half might pass to the afterlife, while the other could still be lost on earth, becoming an inhuman spirit, eventually considered demons. The thinking soul was physical, able to move objects or interact with people, so the dead at peace might move items or reach out to say goodbye to their family, while the restless might try to cause mischief or take revenge on the living. Likewise, this soul could be seen in reflections, so even if they were at peace with their living family, those souls might still become trapped to the world of the living by seeing themselves in a mirror and becoming fixated, or fixating on their family or their home and refusing to leave it behind. Through all of this, we see importance in the care given for the recently dead by their living family, with mistreatment or the lack of fulfilling funerary obligations risking the stranding of the dead or even their transformation into something tragic. Since the soul was physical, it would need to be given food and supplies by their family during their burial, these supplies taken by the soul to help them on their long journey to the afterlife. Some regions took this further, such as villages in Poland who built small bridges over streams specifically for the dead to use to cross the water. Weapons buried with the dead likely doubled as both remembrance of the dead's life, spent as a warrior or a hunter, and to supply them with the means to hunt for food and to defend themselves as they traveled to the afterlife. The soul of the mind was thought to travel to the afterlife, but return to the living world on the anniversary of their death and around the holidays of death, likely guided on their long winding journey under the protection of the gods of death. Before we follow these deceased souls on their journey to the afterlife, we should explore how the dead and their gods of death related to one another. In our last video, we explored the different ways which different cultures conceptualize their deities. Likewise, scholars often like to group deities from across world cultures into similar categories to ease in studying. But we should be careful not to take these for granted. We need to ask what we're really trying to communicate when we call a deity a god of death. Within religious studies, scholars tend to identify general types of gods of death. A psychopomp is a figure who transports departed souls from the earth to an afterlife, from Anubis to Hermes and the ferryman Charon to various Abrahamics, with archangels Michael, Azrael, Samuel, or even Santa Muerte. In contrast are gods of the moment of death, sometimes a personification of death as a force or phenomena. Most famously the Grim Reaper, the Ares and Thanatos, the goddess Hel, who also oversees Helheim, Fistula, or the Plague Crone. For simplicity, we'll call these two types of figures the Guardian and the Reaper, mainly because psychopomp and personification of the moment of death are too awkward to say another 20 times in a video. Besides these two categories, the most famous gods of death that people tend to think of are those we'll call caretakers. From Osiris to Hades to Lucifer or Satan, these are the figures who rule over an afterlife, without personally taking part in the moment of death or the transportation of souls. Additionally, while all these deities deal with the dead once they've begun the process of death, many traditions leave the decision of who dies, the choice of who lives and who does not, to some equivalent of fate or the fates. Now, we need to stress that not every religion includes deities or figures that fit these categories, and a deity can fit into one or more of these categories while otherwise being completely different from the other deities in the same category. This comparative study mostly helps us make sense of religions with less primary and secondary evidence. We're left with a lot of confounding blanks, and by using comparative evidence we can fill in a few of those blanks, but we should be cautious not to paint too broadly or speculate too freely. Over the history of the study of Slavic polytheism, different authors have drawn their different readings, but the last few decades have developed a sort of soft consensus over which Slavic deities might best fit each role. Famously, the caretaker of the Slavic afterlife was most likely typically Veles, the opposite to the chieftain god Perun, and also a god of wide and varied domains, from nature to animal husbandry to wealth and merchants, to magic and chaos, disorder, and the unknown. While initially argued over, historians generally now consider the Slavic Reaper to be Marzanna, who is also a goddess of winter, sleep, and both nighttime dreams and waking illusions. Lastly, the Guardian is sometimes argued to be Marzanna, sometimes argued to be a regional variant of Molkosh or Mother Earth, and other times argued to be the highly obscure Western god, or Nyja, who will be an entire discussion on their own. It's striking that, while many religions see two or all three of these roles filled by deities mostly dedicated to their domain of death, the non-Slavic deities also oversee very extensive and significant domains beyond that of death. This is sometimes used to argue for an additional god of death, possibly Chernobog, or even a deity lost to time. But while we will eventually discuss that deity on his own, and the possibility of a missing deity, for now we'll consider the other possibility which works with the evidence we have at hand. That the multifaceted domains of death speaks to the dualistic or polymorphic natures we see in most Slavic deities, and to explain that further, let's finally take our first close look at an individual deity, the goddess Marzanna. We only have a few historical accounts mentioning Morena, which date to the proximity of the pagan era, while Great Moravia saw official conversion to Christianity around 900 and Poland in 966. The majority of rural people in both countries remained pagan through much of the 1000s, and both maintained a decent pagan minority until the Teutonic Wars intensified and Lithuania was baptized in the late 1200s to early 1300s. Our major sources date to the late 1300s through the mid-1400s, a time when paganism was drastically reduced to the countryside and continually declining, but still prevalent enough to warrant targeting from the church. By this time, most of what was called paganism was likely double faith, a syncretic form of Christianity which combined it with polytheism. Both the syncretic double faith and a more straightforward polytheism without Christian elements would both just be called paganism, which makes it very difficult to study the rise of dual faith as original polytheism declined. But if we use the dates we have to estimate, we know that widespread paganism was somewhat present only about 150 years before most of our accounts. So the impact of paganism on popular culture or common knowledge was still considerable. Even if most people were no longer openly pagan themselves, they were still celebrating incredibly pagan holidays to the frustration of the church. They wore colorful and decorative outfits with lots of jewelry in defiance of the church, who wanted them to dress more modestly. While today it's harder to remember or discern what did or didn't begin under paganism, the church officials living only 150 years after, who wrote most of the accounts we have, since they were the most educated people prepared to write, likely would have had a much better idea of which customs originated under paganism, which likely encouraged their pushback against these customs. And while many of the writings produced by the church in this era don't survive, we have a precious few who do, who give us an indication of the lingering faith of their time. These sources tend to compare Slavic deities to Greek and Roman ones, mostly since the church officials learned about Roman gods as involved with the development of Christianity, which emerged as a political force in imperial Rome. Comparing another pagan religion to the Roman one was a quick shorthand for the holy people visiting from other countries, and a way for holy people within the country to distance themselves from the allure of deities and their local culture. If the local deities could be identified with ancient Roman ones, that would just make them the same familiar demons that the church had been combating for hundreds of years. The oldest of these sources, from Czechia, compares Marzanna to Hecate, a complicated Greek goddess controlling magic, ghosts, necromancy, the moon, and crossroads in transitional or liminal settings. Two following Polish accounts compare Marzanna to Ceres, a Roman agricultural and mother goddess. In her Greek equivalent Demeter's myth, her sorrow over the loss of her daughter Persephone causes the winter, and the joy of her reunion with her daughter causes the summer. The Romanized Ceres remained a symbol for the boundary between life and death, taking roles in funerary rites and sometimes being seen as a guardian of dead souls. She could be associated with the harvested crops, a wheat crown, poppies, sickles, as well as fruits, cornucopias, and other aspects of agriculture. Both comparisons involve goddesses with aspects involving death, but with one primarily seen as motherly and agricultural, and the other seen even historically as a fearful or even foreign goddess. This raises a question over how we should interpret these comparisons. Do we consider the overlapping traits of the two goddesses as the only message being conveyed, with the extra details of both simply being irrelevant baggage? If we consider the entire domain of a goddess as relevant, then how do we reconcile the conflicting nature of the full domains of both goddesses? We'll return to this question once we've covered more material, but keep it in the back of your mind. Past that, any information from historical writing are references to the drowning of Marzanna. Her well-known general appearance comes from her costume, an ancient, sharp-featured or withered woman, often with dark hair or pale skin, once wearing a real dress which was reused each year, but nowadays dressed in a simplified outfit which can be burned and drowned with her effigy. Her dress and crown varied, but almost always either evoked an older married woman, with her headscarf and jewelry which calls her marriage to mind, or even as a bride with a bridal floral headdress. The outfit reused each year wasn't an everyday dress, but typically specifically either an older woman's best clothes for special occasions, or essentially a wedding dress. Also regionally, including most of Silesia, Slovakia, and Czechia, Marzanna's effigy was drowned alongside a male companion who also dressed finely, though his name is less prevalent, and their connection is referenced passingly, never properly defined in surviving songs. The removal of Marzanna's gown likewise has been compared to očepine, an archaic wedding custom where the bride, just after becoming married, had her headdress removed and her long braid of hair maintained throughout her childhood, cut and unbraided to symbolize her maturation. While not universal, Marzanna is sometimes disrobed and burned specifically by young girls, often dressed in the type of fine dress clothes also worn to special occasions like weddings. So some writers have suggested the ritual as a reverse wedding custom, where the young retake their symbols of youth to reflect nature's renewal within the yearly cycle. Marzanna was usually drowned during or in the proximity of the equinox, which in the pagan era fell around the middle of March, but by later in Christianization fell around the 20th. And March, now called Marzec, but once also called Brzeźń or Birch, has remained one of the few primary months for weddings, credited later to a superstition that months with an R sound are better to wed within. There's an interesting correlation between Marzanna and themes of marriage, not strong enough to make any assertions about her domain. I certainly don't think it's evidence for Marzanna as a goddess of marriage specifically, but our discussion would feel incomplete without noting it. Each detail is evocative. We might assume Marzanna as a wife or even a mother, but we miss the folk story for context, the rare instance where an entire ritual survives mostly intact, but the folk story it paired with is seemingly lost. Interestingly, a few glossaries within historical texts also mention Marzanna, however these glossaries are contentious. The authors of this time were looking for national identities and pride in their history, to help resist cultural extinction under their colonial rulers. But this resurging interest brought both accidental and intentional misinformation. Many writings from this time have been excluded by scholarship for their total inaccuracy. Certain material was falsified. Other material from this era seems to reference older documents or genuine contemporary folklore, but are still often excluded from study for the difficulty in verifying anything they say. We need to take these sources with very heavy scrutiny. While some accounts again call her Ceres or Demeter, another likens Marzanna to Venus, the Roman goddess of love, who also carries attributes of war, death, and destructive devotion, while another likens her to Mars, the Roman god of war, and another likens her to Persephone, the daughter of Demeter who joined Hades in the underworld and became the queen of the dead, carrying attributes of magic and mercy or peace and death. These passages tend to be dismissed by the surface-level attributes of these three being unrelated to death, but if we humor the chance that these comparisons were educated and intentional, they might shed further nuance in how each of these authors saw her specific relationship to the domain of death. The similarities between these deities are secondary attributes to death, and they're defined by their differences in how they relate. The comparison to Persephone stands out to me as especially interesting, as at least to me her domain over death seems to fall between that of Ceres and Hecate, less mysterious and threatening in the sense of Hecate, the element of mercy drawing her closer to Ceres, but unlike Ceres, still instantly and predominantly thought of as a death deity. She's in a way a reverse of her mother, with a primary association in death and secondary associations in nature and agriculture. If motherhood is an important association of Marzanna, then either Persephone or Ceres can embody the importance of that role. Both are mothers in their mythology. With historical material running out, most further study of Marzanna explores her etymology, the study of the history, development, and meaning of her name. Her most common names, Marzanna, Morana, Morena, derive from mar and mor, a linguistic root for death. But she also gave her name to mad or insane people, to moths or similar insects, to a wide variety of demons who sometimes relate to dreams or death, and in some regions, her root mara itself changed to mean dreams or illusions, implying the common word Mara descended from the name of the goddess. These demons are complicated and their attributes variable. A few display interesting thematic trends also found with Marzanna, such as the swamp women and water women from across the Slavic world, who might appear as beautiful young maidens one moment and as frightful hags or living corpses the next, as they bait their victims out into the water and then drag them beneath the water and drown them. From this wide variety of demons and spirits, the most interesting to discuss here might be Poludnica, or Lady Midday, a spirit in a wreath of wheat who wanders the fields during harvest, carrying her distinct scythe. Any farmer in a field still working at midday, the hottest hour when they're supposed to be resting, will likely find themselves alone as their fellow farmers are resting, and out in the field alone, they'll likely first see a beautiful young maiden in the distant field, beckoning them to her. And as he approaches, comes close to her, she reveals her horrific form as she strikes her victim down with her tool, just as the farmers do the wheat, harvesting their soul. We don't intend to claim that Poludnica and Marzanna are the same folklore figure, but we recognize that Marzanna in much modern art is depicted with a scythe, but we're unable to find a direct historical reference which associates Marzanna with the scythe. While they're probably not the same, these figures were believed in by the same culture. There is a possibility of a common motif, or a common type of figure, just as the similarities between Mara or Marzanna and the spirits she gave her name to. Speculation can be made on whether Marzanna's scythe could be historical but simply unattested, or if they could be the product of syncretism within Slavic customs. It's typically implied that Marzanna's scythe came from association with the Grim Reaper, but it could also reasonably be argued that it came from syncretism with Lady Midday within the same tradition. We can't know for sure or answer with certainty, but it's just as reasonable to look for explanations of new attributes within a tradition as it is to look outside their tradition. In syncretic double faith, saints or folklore figures often take on the attributes and stories of pagan gods while using less conspicuous names. Among dozens of enticing figures are the many characters of the winter solstice, most famously the winter patriarch, varying greatly from Gwiazdor, or Old Man Star, and his companion Lady Star, found in Greater Poland, to the famous Father Frost within Eastern folklore. Often these celestial beings, along with others like the Lady of Thunder Candle, illuminate the winter with the promise of summer's eventual return, while other figures embody the winter and the presence of Veles and Marzanna on Earth with the thinning of the boundary between the Earth and the afterlife. Among a procession of colorful winter demons, one figure stands out, the Winter Woman, a frozen feminine figure with a sharp or deathly, but sometimes strangely beautiful face. She might have related to a version of Mary who was celebrated in early winter, sometimes venerated on December 4th or in the proximity of, with festivities which included sleigh rides, though it's hard to know how widespread White Mary was between regions. While her surviving folklore is much more scarce than other folklore figures, it's incredibly notable that her presence in Russian popular culture has been renewed in a unique form. Hans Christian Andersen was a Danish writer who drew from his local folklore to write stories like The Little Mermaid, The Emperor's New Clothes, and The Snow Queen. Of course, the Snow Queen was an original character created by Hans, but the story reached Russia in the mid to late 1800s, and it left a powerful cultural impact, with many readers identifying the character of the Snow Queen with their faintly remembered folk character, sometimes White Mary. Because of this, modern Russians sometimes erroneously remember the Snow Queen as being a Russian story, or based on a Russian fairy tale, when the similarity between the character and figure is just coincidental. While there's nothing of Marzanna to be found in the Snow Queen, it's a fascinating example of chaotic cultural exchange, and seeing how the blurring of a popular culture figure from possibly Marzanna in the distant past into White Mary into a cultural memory that primed Russians to latch on to the Snow Queen. It's a fascinating case study that helps us understand how similar processes combined gods from different religions in the past, a window into a more modern example of syncretism, albeit with a fictional character. While the name Marzanna and its variants are the name given by historical accounts, the very same or similar customs of drowning and burning an effigy of the Lady of Winter can also be named Śmiertka, derived from the word for death, specifically as the event or the moment of death. Regionally, this less common name for the holiday or effigy can't be proven to date to the pagan era, but we can find a fairly old example of this name being associated with a feminine personification of death. In the 1400s, Poland was a Catholic country, but peasants and rural communities continued to practice double faith, and the most remote mountain and forest villages are thought to have remained practicing some level of paganism through to the 1500s. Spurred by the rising bubonic plague, most of Christian Europe started personifying death as a skeletal figure holding a scythe, a concept which would be named the Grim Reaper a few centuries later. The details of how this figure developed remain debated in academia. One theory suggests that Kronos, the Greek titan of the harvest and the passage of time, depicted as holding a scythe, might have been adopted by the early church as part of their early use of Greco-Roman symbolism, transforming the titan of time into the personification of running out of time. When paired with the cruelty Kronos could show in mythology, the consumption of his children, this theory posits that cruel and deathly popular trope well known to the church slowly mixed with plague symbolism like the dance macabre until it developed Kronos into the Reaper that we know today. The uncertain origins of the Grim Reaper make the history of Śmiertka much more complicated. Due to the destruction of pagan idols and the scarcity of material written about Marzanna, we have no way to know whether Marzanna held a scythe or sickle during the polytheist era, or whether these were added because of the influence of the Grim Reaper, as the Reaper spread through Europe. We do see specific artistic depictions of a feminine death named Śmiertka, which could make exciting connections between these depictions and Marzanna, thanks to their connection in the regional drowning, but Śmiertka derives from a word meaning death, so the sharing of her name and a few traits could just be a coincidence. We lack the information to assert one possibility over the other with any certainty. Within the same time frame as our descriptions of Marzanna as Ceres or Hecate, another author, their name lost to time, was writing a detailed dialogue with Śmiertka herself. Much like the creation myth of our last video, this long-form poem was written from a Christian perspective, but contains perspectives unlike those from the standardized church, likely denoting those beliefs as products of dual faith. Written in a time where rural pagans were well known and targeted by the church for conversion, and things like their holidays kept pagan concepts in the zeitgeist. The story has value by its own merit, so I'd like to tell an abridged version. A printing of the full text is linked in the bio for anyone who speaks Polish. Within the dialogue, a well-educated man prays to God for an opportunity which is granted to converse with Śmierci, death herself. Sent in answer to his prayer, she appears as a woman, holding her scythe in a rotten skeletal hand, ribs visible through decaying skin, turning yellow by loss of blood, her lips and nose withered away. Why are you afraid? You seem healthy, and yet you groan. The Lord made it happen this way, because you prayed to him so much that I would appear and show you all my power. So here I stand. Take a good look at me. I will reveal myself like this to all when I deprive them of life. Don't fear me this time. When I come, my dearest, to you, then you will truly feel sick. You will cast furtive glances until sweat pours from your body. I will pounce like a cat on a mouse until your heart pants for breath. You won't care for plums with honey when I bring the jug of poison. You will have plenty of sorrow. You will abandon your lover. Forsake all this, I'll order you. Against your will, I'll wrench you away. Speak, because I have work to do. If you want to talk with me, you see I am at work. Why are you so unhappy? My scythe cuts rushes, grass, no one will escape it. Arise, master, and answer if you can. Don't you understand Polish? No game of chance will help you. You are frightened, poor soul. Now recover your senses, pitiable man. Speak to me, poor cleric. Don't be afraid of my school today. I won't have you read a lesson. The master spoke very humbly. I feared that I would perish. What has happened is very distressing, because you frightened me so much, and if you said something cruel, all of my veins would burst. You would kill me on the spot, and chase my soul. I beg you, step back a little, because I don't know what has happened to me. I feel faint and turn pale. My health and hopes are gone. Please, throw away the scythe, so I may raise my head. Master, your words are useless. I am not ready to deal with you. I hold my scythe in readiness. I take the night's lodging by force. Stand up. You can trust me. I don't want to betray you today. The master stood up with effort, staggering. His legs trembled. He was frightened. Dear Death, pray reveal to me. Why do you want to take people's lives? Why did they lose your favor? What did they do to wrong you? We want to bring you gifts so that you can be appeased. I would have a good cake baked if I could run away from you. Keep your gifts to yourself. You only anger me twice as much. I don't profit from these gifts. If you want to know why exactly, I'll tell you most clearly. The Father of all creation has granted me such power that I can kill by day and night. I slay in the east, in the south, and I do this work wonderfully. In the north to the west, I walk not looking for the way. This is my greatest joy, when I have many to kill. When I start to dance with my scythe, I want to bite 1,000 of them. I put to death the wise and the foolish. In this I show my great power. Whether sick or healthy, I'll take everyone's life. Whether old or young, whether rich or poor, whether princess or counts, I'll take them all with me. I'll pluck the crown from the king, I'll pull him by the hair under the scythe. I also appear in the emperor's palace in winter, summer, and autumn. All traitors and usurpers, innkeepers who cheat in serving beer, they seldom remember me when they fill up their money bags. Then they find out about my scythe. When they visit my school, I'll pour pitch down their throats. I have power over good people, but more over the wicked. Whoever commits the most sins, I'll break his bones. If you want, I'll disclose more to you, but reflect on it well. I'll tell you about my scythe. Just sniff it with your nose, if you want to see how sharp it is. Your sister will cry over you. Your tricks will be of no avail. Very quickly your legs will shake. You'll change your tune at once. The Almighty permitted me to put the living to death. My strength is always famed. I have put giants to death. Solomon so wise, fair Absalom, Samson very strong, and the giant Viershik. I took vengeance on them, and I made my scythe happy. I also perform unusual deeds. I hang some, behead others. The magister responded, I don't know with whom you'll make friends, since you destroy all people. When you do away with all people, where will you run away yourself? People's friendship is needed everywhere, so that they would warm you up in their bath, and you would soak with sweat as if you toiled very hard. With help you could work much better. Why do you interrupt me with your talk? You talk to me so boldly that I'll cut your head off, even in church. Look here, you simple-minded master, you don't understand this business. I don't want to take your clothing, nor your great possessions. Your raisins and almonds never meant much to me. Your velvets and precious fabrics, I never wanted to have them. I dearly love human sin, and I will never forsake it. The clergyman and the layman, I'll deprive them of all life. I slay and rob all of them, and never pay a penalty for it. Canons and parish priests will yet be in my school, and vicars with fat necks who drink beer a lot, with chins hanging on their breasts. Good merchants, horse traders, my scythe will punish them all. Murderers and brutes, I'll turn them into corpses. Whoever throws himself willingly into battle, I'll cut off his hands and shoulders. I'll tear him away from his beloved, and make a fool out of him. I want to curl his hair myself until he changes his tune. I stage a show for the people, and always treat them alike. I kill judges and court clerks. I will cause them a lot of sorrow. When they judge their own families, they very often err in their verdicts, but when Judgment Day arrives, the judge will come down a peg, will not go to trials anymore, making illegal postponements, violating valid judgments, will not impose excessive fines, take gifts from malefactors, clearing them of their crime. All this will be revealed and cruelly avenged. This poem can be analyzed for connections to Christian development and contemporary politics. Just like today, most literary works focused on discussing the society they were written in, but regardless of deeper theming, the core of the work draws on a persona of death who was likely well known to the time. Such is the function of a work like this. The character familiar, so that the sentiment they say can be the focus. Much like how Greek authors would use the gods known to the audience to explore new themes, or as Shakespeare took much older stories and retold them to a contemporary audience, while exploring updated themes with symbols and recognizable events of his time. This is still basically how we tell stories today. The same use of common cultural elements and characters are now reflected by things like memes, utilizing multiple layers of meaning via familiarity. Since it's a work of fiction written to discuss society from a church member, we can't rely on his characterization of the personified death to perfectly match pagan beliefs, but by drawing from his contemporary popular culture, it's likely somewhat in approximity. Her appearance as a dreadful ancient woman, the references to love cut short, and symbolism in her scythe are all tantalizingly familiar to us. She looks a lot like the Marzanna we know, as compared to Hecate, but there's more I want to explore. We tend to see interpretations of Marzanna as somewhere here, that a Hecate-like goddess is accurate, while a Ceres or Ares or Persephone-like goddess are flatly erroneous. But if we try to develop our cultural context around these people who worship Marzanna and preserved her into dual faith, conceptions of gods are shaped by their culture, and to those who believe in gods, the culture in turn becomes shaped by the gods. Through Slavic culture, and especially Polish culture, it's rare to see folk concepts which are one-sided. After all, most demons in folklore are victims of tragedy, further mistreated in death. The enigmatic Baba Yaga, who captures naughty children, but who also provided the young heroine Vasilisa with her liberation from familial abuse. In our second video, we touched on the positive and negative nature of folk figures, the bogovye as givers and takers of fortune. So rather than calling her a goddess of death, a catch-all label from comparative academia, it feels appropriate to attempt an understanding of Marzanna with more complexity as a figure worshipped by a culture with moral complexity. The effigy of Marzanna is drowned around the spring equinox, as rivers flow deeper from springtime runoff and melting snow. Marzanna is dressed in fine clothing, sung to, then burned and cast downstream. Herself constructed of dried straw, which otherwise would feed or warm livestock, an amount of time, volume of material, and most importantly, human song, with lyrics imbued with magical value, since human word was magical to ancient Slavs. This Marzanna ritual is ultimately a sacrifice, but who is the sacrifice for? The framing is clear. When Marzanna's effigy is cast away, the winter leaves with her. Then flowers are carried to welcome the goddess of spring. But that invites the question, if the second celebration is the offering to springtime, then why is Marzanna given offerings beforehand? Some regions, such as far western Poland, record an idea that Marzanna is a sacrifice to the demons of winter, who are appeased by offering her life to them, so they drag the winter away with her. So in those cases, the songs, material, and time given to Marzanna build her as an offering to those others. But this could easily just be a regional praxis. Most versions of the holiday identify Marzanna herself as the direct causer of winter, above or apart from the winter demons. So we'll continue with caution to ensure we aren't projecting regional faith too widely. To understand her drowning, the offerings made to her, and the nature of her sacrifice, we should recognize a cultural theme the custom existed alongside. In Polish folklore, the city of Kraków was founded by Krakos, prince of the tribal Vistulans. His daughter Wanda was elected queen following his death, as her domain came under the ambitions of a German prince, who began amassing forces to attempt to conquer Poland. He issued young Queen Wanda a demand. He would take Poland, either by bloody conflict, or by sparing her people by taking her hand in marriage. If she complied, German custom dictated the surrender of Lesser Poland, her domain, into his domain. So unsure what to do and how best to help her people, Wanda prayed to the pagan gods and was inspired to resist. In one rendition, she led the Vistulan army to meet the Germans. They fended them off, and having secured her people's borders and sovereignty, Wanda threw herself into the river Vistula, drowning herself as repayment to the gods for ensuring their victory and freedom. In another, she went from prayer to the castle tower and sacrificed herself immediately, diving from the tower and into the Vistula in return for the freedom of her people, and in defiance of a foreign king forcing his authority over her and her people. Wanda's remains were taken to a great kurgan on the outskirts of Kraków, she and her father the only rulers of the area granted with these great monuments. While Wanda's story was the only of its kind written down in full, many Slavs seem to have similar stories, constituting a motif, with Czech and Slovak folk songs evoking a similar conception and critiquing the older folklore, songs from later in history criticizing those from earlier. But a person's self-sacrifice is far from the only case where rivers carry offerings. From Noc Kupawi on Midsummer's Night, when young women cast wreaths downstream. In the most famous variant of Kupawi, if a young man retrieved the wreath from the river, he'd be fated to marry the young woman who sent it downriver and wore it earlier in the day. Though even in this alteration, the candles and a few wreaths will never be recovered, and other alternations use floating wreaths for divination without recovering them, seeing them lost downstream. The floating of paper boats, or smaller wreaths, or flower constructs, can be found throughout smaller regional customs, from the Czech Republic through Poland, as regional customs which tell fortunes, serve as divination, or are involved with seeing the future of a married couple when floated on their wedding day. From a queen sacrificing herself downstream for her country, young lovers casting flowers with hopes to preview their fates, and the goddess of winter cast downriver to return to the afterlife and make room for the spring. The themes of Marzanna's possible partner and the river-based divination suggest, at least to us, while her idol is ultimately destroyed, the holiday feels closer to an act of remembrance, closer almost to the funeral celebrations a year after a death. The first half of the holiday is distinctly for Marzanna, and there's something she gains from it, with symbolic similarities to folklore sacrifices and young lovers, in many ways reminiscent less of a sacrifice of her, and closer to the sacrifices made by family members at funerals. All of this interestingly evoking similar folkloric sacrifices and offerings from young lovers. One key difference separates Marzanna from Vanda, from young couples, and all human similarities, and that's her cyclical nature, her seeming immortality. Every spring she dies, be it literal or metaphorical. In every autumn she returns to the world of the living, bringing the winter along with her. Marzanna's death is much like the death she brings to the world, a death which is closer to sleep or cyclical renewal. Her winter puts small animals to sleep in their burrows, sends the birds south for warmth, makes trees lose their leaves and small plants wither away, but the trees are only hibernating and reawaken in the spring. And while most crops die with the snow, they also leave seeds which sprout in their place in the spring, renewing their life. Winter can never last forever. It leaves and returns as its goddess does. So we should question whether Marzanna's death or destruction in her ritual is even meant to be death in the human sense. We've looked at the dual nature of the soul. The soul in the head passes to the afterlife, and the soul in the heart can become recycled into new forms of life. So is the Marzanna who we burn as an effigy the soul of the head or of the heart? Because destroying the effigy with fire somewhat evokes cremation. If Marzanna is to be understood as a body with two halves of her soul, then the soul of her head likely returns to the afterlife. So does the destruction of her effigy allow the soul of her heart to break down and be recycled into nature, as with humans? Does her body's death allow for the soul of her stomach to be recycled into the springtime goddess? Or otherwise allow the springtime goddess to use her life force to renew nature? This is just interpretation, but if we do associate Marzanna this way, as a goddess whose travels from life to death and back are like the soul of the head, while the recycling of her soul of the heart fuels the renewal of nature, that tie between her and the soul of the head also helps illuminate another aspect of her domain. As previously said, Marzanna's name was given to demons relating to sleep, nightmares, illusions, or hallucinations, the insane. All of these pertain to the soul of the head. Slavs believed that, as a person slept, the soul in their head could leave the body and wander. In some traditions, the soul's adventures as the body slept were literally the source of dreams. The dreams a person had were literally what the soul of the head encountered while they wandered free at night. And in others, the wandering soul could take the shape of an animal or possess animals. This involved with traditions often simplified as werewolves. In this, death and sleep were similar conditions, but in one, the soul of the head left the body, but returned at the end of the night, and in the other, the soul of the head could not return, probably due to the loss of the soul of the heart in the process of death. In other words, the sleeping body was thought to have the soul of the heart, but not the soul of the head. It makes sense for the goddess of death to take domain over both occasions where the soul of the head leaves the body. Likewise, certain mental disorders or insanities were sometimes understood as the work of demons, or sometimes understood as a condition where the soul of the head was essentially sick, a sort of permanent dream or something along that line, where the soul of the heart was fine. Likewise, under this framework, ailments of the body involved a fine soul of the head, but an ill soul of the heart. The preservation of Marzanna's name in the names of demons might be explained by her own ghastly appearance, but her name remaining most strongly as a word for insane people isn't as readily apparent from her appearance or her holiday. It's likely that Marzanna's influence over the soul of the head was remembered by church officials, and that the association between that domain and insanity outlasted her open worship in an act of linguistic preservation independent from the holiday. This aspect's usually discussed separately from her domain over winter, but once we connect them through the soul of the head, the ideas don't seem separate ideas, but become inseparable. The aspects of illusion and ghosts associated with Hecate, and the role of causing winter, and the life cycle of crops associated with Ceres and Persephone, these two domains which seem so severed when compared to Roman gods, now seem more unified under Slavic conceptions of the two-part soul. But we also seem no closer to folklore attestations of Marzanna as any of her categories of death deity. The dialogue with death shows her as a reaper, but enabled by the Holy Father, with the constant implication that she's powerful, but unable to control the domain of fate. If that's transferred to pagan theology, Rod and the Rogenius are likely candidates for the deities who actually control when someone's fated to die. So following the story, seeing Marzanna in the role of a reaper, we should ideally also find implications of that within her folklore. We might see Marzanna as a reaper within her holiday if we read her drowning as a reversal of her domain over death, with the reaping goddess becoming the reaped. But it could also be read more widely. If Marzanna is goddess of dreams, allowing the soul to wander in sleep, and the goddess of insanity and illusions, altering something about the soul of the head, then she'd naturally also be involved with the final removal of the soul of the head from its body. Spoken so plainly, the connection seems simple. Marzanna is the pagan Slavic reaper, so we can finally conclude this video, right? But that's still only half her story. During Holidays of the Dead, the souls of the head of deceased family return to Earth to visit the living. Their assignment to the afterlife isn't permanent, just as Marzanna's isn't, just as winter and dreams are temporary conditions. Marzanna and all of her domains are cyclical, so calling her the goddess of death with the modern connotation of death as permanent feels somewhat inaccurate to her historical conception. Marzanna was the goddess of the winter, its inevitable disappearance and its inevitable return, of sleep and the eventual awakening, of death and the eventual return of ancestors. Marzanna is remembered by the moment she's severed from this world and sent to the next, traveling along the river which brings her to the afterlife. She is the goddess forever depicted in a transitory moment. She has domain over the half of the soul which makes an individual, allowing it to outlive the death of their body and exist on its own in the afterlife. Marzanna might best be described as the goddess of liminality, standing on both sides of the threshold in the state of perpetual transition. We previously described Veles as the causer of change, or the creator of chaos, while Marzanna is the goddess who forever passes between chaos and order, unable to cause it or control it, but the master of navigating it. If everyone must pass away, and she must deliver all dead souls, she will do so by mastering an art in her task, and if everyone must sleep, she will fill every sleeping mind with her dreams. When looking for information about Marzanna, sources like online blogs or Wikipedia will often describe further details. Most additional information about Marzanna comes from the various modern pagan communities, from the disingenuous Book of Veles, to doctrines adopted by the different organized pagan societies, to independent readings by individual practitioners. This information has no known or clear historical origin, which doesn't necessarily mean it's incorrect, but it's important to present it as what it is. Information obtained in the modern era. Some of it might be fiction written by dishonest actors, some of it might be gained by genuine divination or divine communication, and some might have originated as theories like those in this video, which were then repeated without sourcing until those mere theories became accepted as fact. It's impossible to tell which of these originated which way, so they'll briefly be discussed together to be taken with a grain of salt. The most famous might be Marzanna's association with the moon, the origin of which is unclear. The Greek Hecate was sometimes associated with the moon's personification Selene, while Artemis, compared to Marzanna's opposite Njia, was also a goddess of the moon. But the closest direct connection between Marzanna and the moon might be her name being given to moths, and the obsession which moths have for the moon, and consequently lights and fire. Slavic folklore varies, but especially in Poland, the moon tends to be a prince or lord, and the sun a princess or lady, and with Svarog or Svarodzik as likely the god of the sun, in contrast to the feminine personification. It's reasonable to speculate that the moon would have an additional feminine goddess as a complement to the masculine prince, and with Marzanna as a mysterious controller of dreams, the moon connotation makes some sense, though it isn't a certain thing. No direct descriptions of divine family trees survived in folklore, and while the various saints syncretized with the gods were often thought to be related to each other, how they were related could vary significantly, as various saints themselves were or weren't syncretized with each other, so it's very difficult to interpret these saintly family trees. Thanks to this, there are countless readings on whether Veles might be her husband, brother, or father, Jevana, her sister or cousin, Perun, her father or uncle, and many proposed identities for the idols within the holiday. Some Radnavers assert the feminine idol isn't Marzanna herself, but rather her daughter, and that the passing of her daughter draws Marzanna to follow her to the afterlife. The male figure in some of her drownings has been claimed to be her son, brother, or lover. We'll explore this deeper in our video about the afterlife itself, but after dead souls finished their long journey to the other world, they generally seemed to pass over or through a body of water, much like the bridges built for souls, but somewhere far away, between this life and the next. Given her transitory nature and her destruction on a passage to the afterlife along rivers, several modern groups consider Marzanna as the guardian of souls as they float downriver to the afterlife, much like Marzanna did. Marzanna as psychopomp, delivering the souls she reaps to the afterlife with her. Meanwhile, other polytheists insist Marzanna has nothing to do with human death at all, and is simply the goddess of winter and dreams. Of course, we can't determine this with certainty, but if we follow the readings we've drawn so far, with Marzanna as reaper but not as guardian, then we might wonder who the Slavic god who takes souls away is, if they aren't Marzanna. Two possibilities, Veles and Chernobog, will be explored in a future deep examination similar to what we've given Marzanna, but a third possibility is known only scarcely, so we can discuss them fairly quickly compared to the others. The theonym Nyja was first recorded in Polish sermons of the 1400s, within the same time as the Dialog with Death. Again, while paganism had vanished from city centers, the church was actively pushing to remove pagan festivals and syncretic faith which persevered in the countryside. Among many of these sermons is one which reads, "For it is forbidden to hear freely these holidays, which unfortunately celebrate according to what was left of the rites of the accursed pagans of our ancestors, unless for punishment. At this festival were indecent exposure and other abominations, which the apostle says should not even be named because of God the Father. However, due to the fact that these preachers have arrived, such things cease, and in many places have already ceased. There is no other name under heaven in which we can be saved, for a man is not saved in the name of Lado, Yasa, Njia, Nyja, but in the name of Jesus Christ. Not Lada, not Yasa, not Nyja, which are the names of idols worshipped here in Poland, as some chronicles of Poles testify." Most of those early chronicles of Polish history, written by church officials in the 12 and 1300s, became lost to time, but in the 1400s, historian Jan Długosz used his status in the church to access those records while they survived, and he compiled all the information he accessed from fellow holy men and from his travels across Poland to compile his general histories of Poland in the model of ancient Greek histories, so information otherwise lost was indirectly preserved in his works, albeit with added layers of summation and opinion which further complicate their reliability. In his writing, Długosz remarks, "They called Pluto Njia, considering him the god of the underworld and the guardian and protector of souls when they leave the body. To him they prayed that their introduction after death would be to better places in the underground. For them, the most important temple was built in the city of Gniezno, to which pilgrims came from all sides." During early Piast rule in Greater Poland, before their unification with Lesser Poland and the baptism of their singular kingdom, those early elected kings considered Gniezno their leading city, the center of the Polani pagans, the city itself named within the folk story of the founding of the Polani tribe by their patriarch Lech. For the tribal Polani and the Poles believed that the city was named in honor of the nest of an eagle who threatened Lech when his hunting party approached them, Gniezno deriving from Gnazdo, meaning nest, and the striking image of the eagle who flew in front of the sun down towards Lech to defend their nest was preserved in his mind and later in the Polish coat of arms, even to the modern day. To say a deity had a temple in Gniezno would imply a high significance to that temple and deity, not too dissimilar to the importance of the Temple of Athena and Parthenon to the Athenian Greeks, to whom Athena was their patron. and since Poland's capital was quickly moved to Poznań during early Christianity, then moving between a few other cities, but often returning to Warsaw, that small city of Gniezno has seen less restructuring or expansion than any of the other former capitals. Today, the modest Lech Hill still rises in the city center, along a low-lying marsh which dips into two surrounding lakes. And today, Lech Hill is capped by the Cathedral of Mary's Assumption, but beneath it are several hundreds of years of archaeological material, including a fortress complex dated to the 900s, which was probably the initial tribal Polani's seat of government. Further back, Gniezno in the 800s featured a settlement on the neighboring Maiden Hill, and featured some form of ritual complex on Lech Hill itself, consisting of a stone mound overlaid with shattered animal bones and pottery, with this mound rising from an indent which would have flooded in much of the year, isolating that mound in a ring of water, on top of a hill overlooking wetlands and lakes. Captivated by this double motif of a mound rising over water, Polish archaeologist Paweł Szczepanik believed this site was the temple of Nyja, described by Jan Długosz. Today archaeologists remain divided, since the site lacks any idol or feature which could directly identify it with Nyja or any deity. Other scholars consider the mound to be a burial site, likely of Lech, for whom the hill is named. This rival theory also has its issues, since remains of a ruler were never identified within the mound, and Lech likely lived a few hundred years before the domed structure was built. It should be noted that the grave of Lech might still be somewhere deeper within the hill, since traces of settlements dating to the 500s or earlier have been found in smaller amounts, and the excavations of the older layers beneath the hill are still ongoing. During that same time frame as Jan Długosz and the several church sermons, Polish linguist Jakub Porkoszewicz mentions Nyja offhandedly. Such spelling was not enough to differentiate, because Nyja, which was the name of the idol, and Njia, a syllable in the word Gnazdo, was no different in spelling. This is interesting in two major reasons. Firstly, Jakub references the name Nyja as something well-known, which the reader is familiar with, the equivalent of us today saying A as an apple, and because he happens to pair Nyja with the word Gnazdo, which again is the root for Gniezno, the city alleged to hold the temple of Nyja. While I've seen certain community members suggest Długosz might have invented a temple of Nyja in Gniezno based off either misunderstanding or deliberate misinterpretation of Jakub's linguistic comparison written a few decades earlier, this could just as easily speak to an obvious and widespread association between Nyja and Gniezno that any average Polish writer would connect them. Again, imagine an equivalent A as in Athena, rather than A as in Athens. Likewise, about 100 years later, late 1500s author Maciej Stryjkowski wrote, Pluto, also the infernal god, whom they called Nyja, praised in the evening, they also asked him for a better and earlier place in hell and rain, or to tame the bad weather, whose church was in holiest Gniezno, as Długosz testifies. Again, we can read this two ways. Maybe Stryjkowski was plagiarizing Długosz on his account and is therefore unuseful, or maybe he's speaking from his own knowledge base and then simply ends by citing Długosz to add authenticity to his claim by citing another author who made the same conclusions he did. It's notably sort of a catch either way, since if he didn't mention Długosz, his similar wording might have still gotten him accused of plagiarism. So thanks to all this uncertainty, different scholars will declare very surely that Nyja is or is not real, with an implication that all other scholars agree with them, when the matter is fairly unsettled. We can't know for sure, but we'd like to continue looking into the possibility of Nyja and cover a little more research. Alexander Bruckner was a linguist and historian active from the late 1800s to early 1900s, a scholar of the Polish language and history during a time where Poland lacked independence or statehood. He was a decorated and accomplished scholar who worked to prove the richness of Slavic and Baltic history and culture to his skeptical German colleagues, but he was also hypercritical of the Russian Empire and Russian imperialism over the Balts and other Slavs. So for his skepticism against Russia, his work was rejected by most Russians. And while his work became outdated by newer theories, it must be stressed that he took his career and the scrutiny of his fellow historians seriously. He wasn't the type to make up nonsense or knowingly, blatantly lie. In his linguistic histories, Hość do Nyja, Bdzisvny, go to Nyja, seems to record the DNM's survival in these everyday curses and insults within the western Polish countryside. From Old Polish Nicz to Eastern Nav or Navia to Proto-Slavic Njia, the root word is thought to mean disappearing, death, corpse, or lying down. The same root is shared in names for the Slavic afterlife, and with a handful of demons in folklore. This isn't much to work with, but we can try to figure out more. Pluto's name derives from words for flowing or overflowing, generally understood as overflowing with wealth, as he was also the god of riches. But his Greek counterpart, Hades, has a name stemming from unseen, invisible, and in the Greek Dark Ages, the name of the deity would be avoided, out of fearful superstition that saying his name would summon him and cause death. The realm of the dead could also be named Hades, and some scholars think Hades isn't the proper name of the deity at all, but stems from the superstition of avoiding his true name by supplementing it with the name of his realm. We see little in Nya's etymology or direct accounts which indicate the ruling over the afterlife as Pluto or Hades did, but with Nyja seeming to stem from words for disappearing or lying down, that might have been the connection to Pluto, through traits associated to him from Hades, which was seen by the holy men who compared Slavic gods to Greco-Roman ones. It's hard to say, there might be a connection there, or this might be giving the authors too much charity. So with lack of better evidence, we'd like to share an explanation that we, the writers of this project, think seems plausible. Take it with a grain of salt, it's just one opinion. If the temple to Nyja was built beside or over the grave of Lech, or if Lech was buried beneath or beside the temple to Nyja, and Nyja's temple was a major sacrificial or divinatory center, as suggested by the many bones and goods at the site, it's reasonable to wonder whether their proximity to each other is intentional, even if we lack direct evidence saying so. Offering to a god of death alongside the grave of the patriarch and founder of the town associates Nyja specifically with ancestors, and suggests the offering to Nyja as a means of caring for the dead. This could imply that Nyja resides over the afterlife, assigning the dead to better or worse fates according to how well their living family offers to them. Or, given the continual travel of dead spirits from the living world to the afterlife and back between holidays and the different seasons, it could make Nyja the guardian or psychopomp of souls, meaning that offerings made to Nyja would help ensure the safe passage of dead ancestors between the worlds. With a name meaning death or disappearing, and with other gods as the likely caretakers of the afterlife itself, we're inclined to read Nyja as the Slavic psychopomp, but it could go either way. Nyja's regional nature, attested only in Poland, could make more sense with them as guardian of the souls. Regionally, Mulkosh, or motherland, could be seen as the transporter of souls from life to afterlife, especially where cremation never developed, and bodies were directly buried into the mother goddess as the mass of the earth. So perhaps Nyja is psychopomp particularly for the cremated, or maybe the guardian of the dead souls varied regionally by ancestors. Maybe that means Nyja is the guardian of souls related to Lech, the Lechites, the northwestern Slavs, and other deities for other lineages. Or they might have just been regional in general. This all gets rather speculative, so we'll stop here, but there's a lot more inference that could be made, and little evidence to help narrow down what's accurate. With a clearer understanding of the gods who reaped and guided the deceased, to the passage from the grave to afterlife, this seems like a good place to catch our breath. In the first draft of this video, we discussed theories on the afterlife, and discussed the god Veles in deep detail. But since we started this video last winter, we've had a bit of family hardship and difficult times. And as that pushed our schedule back, we then read more research, which led us to greatly expand on the material we covered. So we decided it was best to postpone this video until my family was doing better, which allowed us to expand on the topic from a single 15-minute video to a pair of them. This was also a good place to rest because, as you might be able to hear, my throat is sore and I've been sick. In a future video we'll discuss afterlives, Veles, Zernobog, theories of reincarnation, and a few more topics which didn't fit into this installment. So thank you everyone for the patience and support, and I hope to talk to you all again soon.